The first thing I'll tell you about Marin Calve is that she didn't ask for anything. I've run the Green River ferry crossing at Pardo's Bend for 22 years, and in that time I've seen every kind of person the territory could throw at a man: the desperate, the greedy, the bone-tired, the ones who thought the frontier was going to hand them something, and the ones who knew it wasn't. Marin was the second kind. She came across the Mesa Road in the third week of October with a lame bay horse, a wagon not much bigger than a good-sized buckboard, and a canvas satchel she kept on the bench beside her like it was a child. When she pulled up at my landing and I walked out to meet her, she looked at me the way a woman looks at a man she's already decided isn't going to be a problem. "Ferry crossing," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am. $3 for the wagon and the horse, $1.50 for you." She counted out exact coin from a small tin box without fumbling and set it on the plank between us. Then she told me the horse had gone lame on the Mesa Road, and she needed to know where in Holt's Crossing she could find a farrier. Not could she find one, where. I told her Ruddock on the south end of town. She thanked me with a nod, not a word, and walked the horse onto the ferry boards herself rather than wait for me to lead it. I found out the rest in pieces, the way you do with a woman who doesn't offer it. Her husband, Cal Calve, had filed a land claim on a parcel of high meadow above the canyon's east rim 2 years prior. Good grazing land, clean water, the kind of acreage that didn't come free very often in that country. Cal had died of a lung sickness that March without ever getting back to work the claim, and the deed had passed to Marin in the county register at Laramie. Under territorial law, the claim had to be renewed in person at the Holt's Crossing Claim Office before the end of the first week of November, or it reverted to open filing. That gave her 6 days from the morning she crossed my ferry. She knew that. She'd ridden 2 weeks to get there. She wasn't asking whether it was possible. She was moving through the country like a woman who had already decided it was. What she didn't know, what I should have told her sooner, and what has sat with me since, was that the claim parcel she was coming to renew had been under quiet occupation since August. 3 men, a fellow named Huckett and 2 of his riders, had moved onto the meadow under the pretense of a grazing lease that didn't exist in any office I knew of. Huckett was the kind of man who bet that a widow 2 weeks' ride away wouldn't know her rights well enough to argue, or wouldn't have the stomach to make the trip. He'd made that bet before and won it. The Holt's Crossing claim officer, a narrow-shouldered man named Baruff, had been letting the deadline run without sending notice, which was either carelessness or something darker, and I had my suspicion it was the second. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The night Marin Calve crossed my ferry, she made camp on the east bank because the farrier was closed by the time I got her across, and she didn't want to board the horse at the livery without inspecting it first. She set up a small camp, a bedroll, a tin pot, a fire that she kept low and sensible. I was doing my last check of the ferry chains when I saw her at the water's edge filling the pot, and I almost missed the other man entirely. Dex Farrow was sitting 20 yards up the bank in the shadow of a rock shelf, drying his boots beside a fire that was barely a fire at all. I'd known Dex for the better part of a decade, knew him the way you know a river man, which is to say I knew what he was capable of, and I knew what he'd cost himself, and I knew better than to push past what he offered. He'd been the best guide in the canyon country before his wife Lyra died, and after Lyra he'd stayed in the canyon country because he didn't have anywhere else he wanted to go, but he'd stopped taking work. He scouted a little, trapped a little, moved along the river like a man who was just keeping the time between things. He was soaked through from what I guessed was a bad crossing somewhere upstream. The river had been running high and cold with the October runoff. His coat was spread on the rock to dry, and he had the look of a man who had been cold for long enough that he'd stopped noticing it. I watched Marin see him from across the fire's light. She didn't startle and she didn't move away. She watched him for a moment the way you watch a dog to see if it's hurt or if it bites, and then she looked back at her pot, and then she stood and walked over to him. I couldn't hear what passed between them. I saw her put something in his hands, a cup first, and then a small cloth bundle that I realized later was the last of her flour made into a quick flatbread she'd cooked on the pot lid. He looked at it, and he looked at her, and she said something short and went back to her fire. He ate it. That was all. She turned in an hour later. He sat by his own fire, and at some point I stopped watching and went to bed myself, thinking it was a passing thing, the kind of small, frontier courtesy that means nothing past the morning. I was wrong about that. Dex was still on the bank when I came out at first light. That was unusual. Dex moved early, always, the way men who have spent years in wilderness move before the day has a chance to get ahead of them. Instead, he was sitting on the same rock with his dry coat back on, and when Marin came out of her bedroll and started breaking camp, he walked over to her. I was close enough to hear this part. "Where are you headed?" he said. "Holt's Crossing. Claim office. How long you got?" 6 days. He looked at the lame horse, which Marin was checking with her hand along the tendon, her face telling me she already knew what she was going to find. The horse wasn't going to pull a loaded wagon on that leg for 6 days. Maybe not for 6 weeks. "Canyon Trail's the fast road," Dex said. "Mesa Road's 2 days longer." "I know it. Canyon Trail's not a wagon road." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. I knew that quiet. It was the quiet of a man turning something over that he'd already decided but hadn't admitted yet. "I know the canyon," he said. Marin straightened up from the horse and looked at him directly. "I didn't ask." "No," he said. "You didn't." She studied him for long enough that I felt the weight of it from 20 yards away. Whatever she was reading, she read it carefully. Then she said, "I'll need to stable the horse and take what I can carry on my back. That's a heavy pack for a week in canyon country." "2 packs," he said, "are lighter than 1. That was the whole negotiation. No money discussed, no terms laid out. She didn't thank him and he didn't tell her she was welcome. She went to sort her pack and he went to pull his gear from where he'd stashed it in the rocks, and by 2 hours past sunrise they were on the canyon trail heading south along the river. I watched them go from the ferry landing. And I want to be clear that I had no particular feeling about it one way or the other. Dex was a grown man and a careful one, and Marin Calve looked like the kind of woman who'd grown careful the same way granite grows weathered, by having everything unnecessary worn away. If anything, I thought, she gave him a piece of bread when she had very little of it left, and the man has a code, and this is what comes of having a code. What I didn't know yet was what was waiting at the far end of the canyon. I found that out 3 days later, when Huckett's man Ives came through my crossing with 2 horses and a tight mouth, heading the same direction. The canyon trail ran 6 days at a walk, 4 at a push. For a man who knew it, who knew where the river bent against the wall and swallowed the trail, who knew which shelf crossings were solid in October water and which ones pitched you into the current, who knew the camps with firewood already cut and the draws that held off the wind, it could be done in 3 with good legs under you and no wagon to worry about. Dex knew it that way. I got the account of those 3 days in pieces later, from both of them, Dex in the spare way he talked, Marin in the deliberate way she talked, which is to say I had to patch it together myself. But I've thought about it long enough that I can put it down straight. The first day they made good time on the upper trail, which is wide enough and high enough above the river that the October surge doesn't reach it. Dex walked ahead and she walked behind, and neither of them pushed for conversation. That suited them both, I think. Dex had spent 3 years mostly in his own head, and Marin had spent 7 months closing out a life and reorganizing around the fact of being alone in it, and neither of them was in a hurry to fill the air with noise. What they talked about practically. He told her where to put her feet at the loose rock sections. She told him the claim parcel's water situation from Cal's original survey notes, which she'd memorized. He knew the terrain she was describing, had scouted that rim country years before, and he told her Cal had picked well, that the eastern meadow above the canyon had the best grass in the district and a spring that ran year-round. She heard that with her face steady, but I think it meant something to her. Cal had known what he was doing. They made the first camp at a sandstone overhang Dex knew, where the wall threw back heat from a fire, and the river sound was far enough below that you could sleep. He cooked, not because she couldn't, but because he knew the canyons would and she didn't, and a poorly fed fire in that cold could be the difference between a rested morning and a punishing one. She ate what he put in front of her without comment and washed the tin cups herself. That night she asked him one question. "You guided this route before?" "Many times." "What made you stop?" He was quiet for long enough that I think she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Had a wife. Canyon work kept me away from home. When she was gone, I figured there wasn't any point in coming home, so I stopped leaving." Marin was quiet after that too. Then she said, "My husband spent 2 years planning to come back to that claim. He died before he could." Dex looked at the fire. "That's the kind of thing that can stop a person." "Yes," she said. "It can." Neither of them said anything after that, and I think what passed between them in that silence was the kind of thing that doesn't need saying. Two people who had each had the world reorganized by loss, sitting on the same side of it for a night. The second day was harder. The mid-canyon section runs along a shelf trail that drops close to the river at the Big Bend, and in October the river is high and fast and cold, and not interested in the plans of widows with land deeds. Dex knew the shelf was passable but narrow, and he went first and tested every step and called back to her exactly where to place each foot. She did it without fuss, which he told me later was the thing he noticed. Not that she was unafraid, he thought she probably was afraid, but that the fear didn't change her feet. She put them where he told her and she moved through it. Halfway across the shelf, they hit a section where the wall had shed rock since the last time he'd been through, a new slide, maybe from the fall rains, that had pushed the trail edge 2 feet closer to the drop. He stopped and looked at it for a long time. She came up beside him and looked at it too. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough to be careful." "Can we get through?" He measured it again. "Yes." "Then let's get through," she said. He went first, pressed flat to the wall with his pack angled out, moving hand over hand on the rock face. Then he came back on the outside, on the edge, which was the riskier position, and held out his hand for her pack so she could move unencumbered. She handed it to him without arguing, which was smart and he appreciated it, and she crossed the slide section the same way he had, pressed to the wall, taking her time. When she got to the far side, she took her pack back and didn't mention it again. They were an hour past the slide when she said, without preamble, "Thank you for that." "You did it yourself," he said. "You came back to the outside." He didn't answer that, but she'd seen it and he knew she'd seen it, and I think that was the second thing. The shelf section was the second thing that cracked the habit of 3 years. The first was the flower. The third night on the trail, a mile short of the canyon's south end, where the walls open up into the lower mesa country and Holt's Crossing sits 3 miles further on, Dex pulled them up short. They'd been making camp in the last light when he went very still in the way men go still when they've heard something that doesn't fit. Marin saw him do it and went still herself, which I was told later impressed him. A lot of people, when they see someone listening, start talking. What he'd heard was a fire. Not their fire, a fire up the canyon behind them on the trail they'd just come down. He went back a 1/4 mile alone, and came back in 20 minutes with his face set. "2 men," he said, "on the trail, a day behind us, maybe less." Marin looked at him. "From the crossing?" "Maybe." He looked at her carefully. "You said the claim office is in Holt's Crossing." "Yes." "Who else knows you're coming?" She was quiet for a moment. "No one I told, but a land claim that's about to expire. There are people in the county register who can read a calendar. Dex looked at the fire for a moment, and then he told her what I should have told her at the crossing. What I knew about Huckett and about Boruff, and about the pattern of claims in that district that had quietly changed hands in the past 2 years, without a widow ever knowing exactly how it happened. She heard it all without interrupting. When he was done, she sat with it for a moment, the way she sat with hard things not falling apart, just letting the shape of it settle. "So they don't want me to reach the claim office," she said. "Not in time. And Boruff won't have sent notice, because Boruff doesn't want me to know the deadline. That'd be my read." She looked at the fire. "How far to Holt's Crossing from here?" 3 hours on the trail, less if we move at first light and push. The claim office opens at 8. "Yes." "Then we need to be there at 8, she said, and lay down on her bedroll and closed her eyes, and that was the end of the night's conversation. Dex sat up another hour watching the back trail before he slept. She was already up when he woke before dawn. "I'm going to tell you what happened at Holt's Crossing in the order it happened, because that's the only way it makes sense." They came down out of the canyon at first light and hit the lower Mesa Road at a pace that wasn't quite a run. Dex knew the back way into Holt's Crossing, the freight road that came in from the south end of town rather than the main street, and he brought them in that way, because the main street meant passing the saloon, and the saloon at that hour was where Huckett's men went when they were in town. The claim office was a low building on the east side of the square, next to the land registry, with a painted sign that had faded to the point where you could only read it at the right angle. Boruff's name was on the door. It was 7:40 in the morning. The door was locked. Marin stood in front of it and looked at Dex. He looked back at her. "He opens at 8, he said. "It's not 8 yet, she said. They waited. Dex stood with his back to the building wall and watched the street. The town was waking up slowly, a freight wagon, a woman with a market basket, a dog that came to inspect them and left disappointed. At 8:05, a man with a narrow frame and a clerk's coat came around the corner of the land registry and stopped when he saw them. This was Boruff. He looked at Marin and he looked at Dex, and he made the calculation that Dex saw him make, that this was going to be a more complicated morning than he'd planned for. "Office opens at 8, Boruff said. "It's 8, Marin said and held up the satchel. "I have a land deed for renewal. Cal Calve's claim on the East Rim Meadow parcel, District 7. I'm Marin Calve, widow and named heir. I have the deed and the county registration notice from Laramie." Boruff looked at the door rather than at her. He put his key in the lock slowly, the way a man does when he's buying himself time to think. He opened the door and went in, and Marin followed him, and Dex came in behind her. "You'll need to wait your turn," Boruff said, meaning that no one else was there. "I'll wait as long as it takes to process the renewal," Marin said. She put the satchel on the counter and opened it and laid out the deed and the registration notice with the flat certainty of a woman who had memorized the territorial code on land claim renewals, because she had nothing but time on the 2-week ride to read it. "I wasn't in that room, so what I know comes from what Marin and Dex told me, and I'll tell it straight." Boruff looked at the documents. He turned them over. He said something about a procedural requirement for a third-party witness to a widow's renewal, a rule that Marin told him, quietly and specifically, did not appear anywhere in the territorial code for District 7, and that she would like him to show her in writing where it did. He couldn't show her because it didn't exist, because he'd invented it on the spot, and she'd been ready for exactly that. While this was happening, Dex heard boots on the board outside. He turned around. The door opened and 2 men came in, Huckett's riders, the 2 he'd seen on the back trail. They were trail dusty, and they'd moved fast through the night, and the way they came in was not the way a man comes into a claim office on legitimate business. The taller one looked at Dex and said, "You the guide that brought her in?" I'm a man standing in a government office, Dex said. Same as you. Baruf, the tall one, said, there's a procedural. She's quoting me the code, Baruf said, and something in his voice had shifted. I think Baruf had made his own calculation in that moment, looking at a woman with a land deed, and the paragraph citations memorized, and a man like Dex Farrow standing between her and the door, and decided that the shape of this particular morning had changed, and that his involvement needed to stay on the side of the paperwork. The renewal is in order, Baruf said, and picked up his stamp. The tall rider moved, and Dex stepped into the space between him and the counter, and the tall rider stopped. Not because Dex was a large man, he wasn't especially, but because he was the kind of still that men who have spent time in dangerous country recognize as the stillness before a thing that isn't going to go well for everyone involved, and the rider knew enough to read it. She's processing a lawful renewal in a government office, Dex said, very quietly. Both of you can stand there and watch, or you can go back out that door. Those are your two choices. The tall rider looked at the shorter one. The shorter one looked at the window. Neither of them wanted what Dex was offering. Baruf stamped the deed. He wrote the date, October 21st, and the registry number and his own signature, and he handed the renewed deed back to Marin, and he said, in the voice of a man who was going to spend the rest of the day deciding how he felt about what he'd just done, the Calvé claim on East Rim Parcel 7 is renewed for 2 years from this date. Marin took the deed and put it in the satchel and fastened the clasp. Thank you, she said to Baruf, meaning it purely as acknowledgement of a bureaucratic fact and nothing warmer. She turned and walked to the door, and Dex came with her, and the two riders stepped back to let them pass, and they went out into the October morning, and the door of the claim office closed behind them. The riders were gone from Holt's Crossing by midday. I don't know where Huckett went after that. I heard later he'd taken his men off the East Rim parcel and moved to some other piece of country where the math worked better for him. Men like Huckett don't reform, they recalculate. But Marin's deed was stamped and filed and recorded, and the parcel was hers for 2 years, and what she did with it after that was her own business. What I know is what I saw when they came back through my crossing 4 days later. The horse was healed, Ruddock had done his work, and the wagon was loaded again, and they came up the Mesa Road from Holt's Crossing in the late afternoon with the canyon at their backs and the river running gold in the low light. I was on the landing checking the ferry chain when I heard the wagon, and I looked up, and the first thing I noticed was that Dex was driving. Not riding alongside, driving with Marin on the bench next to him. I held the ferry for them and they came aboard, and I made the crossing without saying much because the river wants your attention in October. When we landed on the North Bank, Dex helped with the horse, and I handled the chain, and there was 5 minutes of practical work before there was any talking. Then Marin came and paid me the crossing fee, exact coin again, the same tin box, and she said, I'd like to know what you told him at the crossing before we left. I looked at her. I didn't tell him anything, ma'am. He saw you from the bank and made up his own mind. She considered that. What did you think of it? I thought you gave a cold, wet stranger the last of your flour, I said, and that's the kind of thing a man with any code at all can't just ride past. She looked out at the river. He said he hadn't guided in 3 years. That's true. He said he might take a contract in the spring for a survey party going up the East Rim. I looked at her carefully. That'd be good work. I expect it would, she said. Good country up there. The spring runs year-round, he said. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the North Bank Road, the one that ran up through the Mesa country toward the higher ground. Dex was at the wagon's head, checking the harness, and he wasn't looking at us either, but he'd have heard it. I finished the chain and asked no more questions, which is the right instinct for a ferryman. There's a thing about the Green River Canyon country in late October. The light goes sideways in the late afternoon, orange and flat, and it hits the rimrock and the sandstone and the river all at once, and everything in that light looks like it's been there forever, like it grew there, like it knows what it is. I saw that light on them when they drove off the ferry landing, Dex on the bench with the reins, Marin beside him, the canvas-covered wagon heading north on the Mesa Road. They weren't holding hands. They weren't talking that I could see. The bench was wide enough for two people to sit apart, and they didn't. But they weren't apart either. I stood on the landing and watched the wagon go until it crested the Mesa rise and was gone. And I thought about what I was going to say when people asked me, because in a small ferry crossing people always ask. What I settled on was this. A woman came through who gave her last provisions to a wet stranger on the bank, not because she had plenty, but because she'd been raised to believe that you give what you can when a person needs it, and that a thing given like that doesn't diminish you. And the stranger turned out to have a code of his own, which said that a kindness like that, offered without calculation, offered freely, is a debt that a man of any worth at all pays back. He paid it back, and somewhere between the flower given and the deed stamped and the canyon trail walked and the slide section crossed, two people who had both decided they were done reaching for things found out they weren't. The surveying contract for the East Rim was filed that spring. I saw it come through the county registry, which runs through my crossing the way most paper in this part of the territory does. The contract was for 1 season, renewable. The survey party's listed guide was Dex Farrow. The landowner granting access to the parcel was listed as M. Colvey. I didn't note any of it specially, just filed it and let the ferry take the next load. But I thought about it. I thought about the flower and the fire on the bank, and the way she'd walked to him without being asked. I thought about a man who'd spent 3 years moving through country. He knew the way other men know their own hallways, stopping the habit of all of it because a tired woman with a land deed and a 6-day deadline had given him something from her last tin without asking what he was going to do with it. I thought about code and about how it moves, how you can't see where it goes, but you can see what it does. The way you can't see the current under the surface of the Green River, but you know it's there because of what arrives on the far bank. A woman gave a man the last of her flour on a cold October night. He came back with everything she'd lost. Not the land exactly, she'd gotten that herself, with the deed and the code paragraphs and Borof's stamp. She'd earned that back with 2 weeks in the saddle and 6 days of hard country. No, what he came back with was the other thing, the thing that a frontier can strip from a person slowly, so slowly you don't notice it going, until one morning you realize you're looking at a spring meadow and you're not planning anything for it, not seeing anything in it, just looking at it the way you look at a thing that has stopped mattering. He came back with the reason to build something. And she gave him the same thing back, I think, though neither of them would have said it that way. She gave him a trail that was worth knowing again, a canyon that was worth guiding again, a piece of high country that was worth understanding well enough to show to a survey party. She gave him a morning he was expected somewhere. I've run this crossing for 22 years, and I've watched a good number of things come and go on the river. Mostly what I see is the river. But sometimes what you see on a river crossing is two people on a wagon bench heading north into the Mesa country in the sideways October light, not quite touching and not quite separate, and the canyon behind them and the rimrock ahead, and you think, well, that's what a code looks like when it works the way it's supposed to. I went back to checking my chain. The river didn't care. But I did.